I'm Emma, 48 female. I live, or rather, I used to live, in a sprawling, custom-built mansion overlooking the city, a home I designed myself down to the last doorknob. My life was a meticulously curated masterpiece, built around the successful luxury interior design firm, Vance Interiors, that I co-founded with my husband and our two beautiful children. But on the evening of my 48th birthday, I learned that the perfect life I had designed was nothing more than a stage, and the final act was my public execution. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The morning of my 48th birthday began like any other, which, in hindsight, was the most insulting part of it all. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our master bedroom, catching the light on the crystal glasses on my nightstand and illuminating the soft gray and cream palette I had chosen for the room. It was serene, a sanctuary of my own design. I had built a life on the principle that your environment should reflect your inner peace. The irony of that belief would soon become suffocating. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Richard. He was still sleeping soundly, a man who always claimed he never had a worry in the world. For 25 years, I had believed him. We were a team, the perfect partnership. I was the artist, the visionary. He was the pragmatist, the financial genius who turned my creative bursts into profitable ventures. Vance Interiors was our shared dream, born from a tiny office in our first apartment and now a multi-million-dollar empire with a client list that read like a who's who of the global elite. We weren't just husband and wife, we were a brand. The Vances, a symbol of success, elegance, and unbreakable unity. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Our staff didn't arrive until 8, and I cherished these early morning hours. I made myself a cup of black coffee and walked through the lower level. Every room was a memory, a project I had poured my heart into. The grand living room with its vaulted ceilings and the custom chandelier I had sketched on a napkin during a trip to Italy. The library with its dark mahogany shelves, filled with books on art and architecture. This house wasn't just a structure of glass and stone, it was the story of my life. It was a testament to my talent and hard work. My children, Thomas and Chloe, were my greatest creations. Thomas, at 24, had recently been made a junior partner at the firm. He had my eye for aesthetics but his father's ambition. I was so proud of him, seeing him walk the halls of the company we built, ready to carry on the legacy. Chloe, my brilliant and beautiful 21-year-old, was in her final year of university, studying art history. She was my confidant, the one I'd spend hours with discussing art, fashion, and life. We were incredibly close, or so I thought. That afternoon, I met with Chloe for lunch. She was bubbling with excitement about my birthday dinner. "Dad has something huge planned, Mom," she said, her eyes sparkling. "He told me it's a gift that will change everything." I smiled, picturing a surprise trip or perhaps the vintage sports car I'd been admiring. Richard had always been good at grand gestures. Chloe held my hand across the table. "You deserve it, Mom. You've given us everything." Her words were like a warm blanket, chasing away the faint, unexplainable chill I'd been feeling lately. It was nothing concrete, just a subtle distance from Richard, a few too many late nights at the office he'd brushed off as closing a big deal. I told myself I was being paranoid, that success required sacrifice. Back at the office, I reviewed the final designs for a new luxury hotel project in Dubai. It was my magnum opus, a career-defining project that would cement Vance Interiors as the top firm in the world. I felt a surge of pride. I had done this. My vision, my work. Richard handled the contracts and logistics, but the soul of the company, that was mine. My assistant, a sweet young woman named Clara, brought in a bouquet of my favorite flowers, white lilies. "These just arrived for you, Mrs. Vance. Happy birthday." The card was from Richard. "Tonight, we celebrate the architect of our perfect life. All my love, reading it, any lingering doubts I had melted away. He saw me. He appreciated me. Tonight was going to be perfect." As I drove home, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. A loving husband, wonderful children, a thriving business, a beautiful home. It was the life every woman dreamed of. I had meticulously designed it, polished every surface until it shone, and believed in its flawless structure. I had no idea that the entire foundation was rotten, hollowed out from the inside, and that my loving family was about to watch it all come crashing down on top of me. That evening, I put on my favorite dress, a deep emerald green silk that matched my eyes, and prepared to celebrate the life I had built. I had no idea I was actually walking to my own execution. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns of our estate. The caterers were setting up a lavish dinner in the formal dining room. Richard had insisted on it being just the four of us. A private family celebration, he had said. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his smile as polished and empty as the marble floors beneath my feet. Thomas and Chloe were already there, dressed in their finest, looking like the perfect son and daughter. They hugged me, wished me a happy birthday, their words feeling rehearsed, their touches fleeting. The chill I had felt earlier returned, stronger this time. Something was wrong. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, heavy with a tension that had no place at a birthday celebration. But I pushed the feeling down, chiding myself for ruining the moment. This was my family. This was my perfect life. And I was about to receive a gift that would, as Chloe had promised, change everything. The dining room was breathtaking. A long, polished mahogany table was set with our finest china and silver. Dozens of white candles flickered, their light dancing off the crystal glasses and casting a warm, intimate glow. It was a scene straight out of one of the magazines we were so often featured in. A portrait of domestic bliss and effortless elegance. But the beauty of the room felt like a mask, hiding something ugly underneath. The silence between the four of us was deafening, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery against porcelain. Richard sat at the head of the table, a king in his castle. Thomas was on his right, Chloe on his left. I was seated at the opposite end, suddenly feeling like a guest in my own home rather than its matriarch. I tried to start a conversation, asking Chloe about her classes and Thomas about his work on a new client account. Their answers were short, clipped, their eyes darting towards their father as if seeking permission to speak. "Let us have a toast," Richard finally said, his voice booming with a false sense of cheer. He stood up, raising his glass of champagne. Thomas and Chloe immediately followed suit, their movements synchronized. I smiled, expecting a heartfelt tribute, a loving speech to mark the occasion. I raised my glass, my heart swelling with anticipation. "To Emma," Richard began, his eyes cold and hard, devoid of any warmth. "For 48 years of life and 25 years of partnership." The word hung in the air, heavy and strange. A partnership that has brought us tremendous success, a beautiful home, a powerful company, 2 children who understand the importance of legacy. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Thomas and Chloe, who nodded in solemn agreement. This was not a birthday toast. It was a declaration. "And because our family has always valued honesty and directness," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone, "I believe it's time to be direct now. This partnership has run its course." My smile faltered. My hand, holding the champagne flute, began to tremble. "Richard, what are you talking about? What is this?" He ignored my question, placing his glass down with a decisive click. He reached beside his chair and pulled out a thick, navy blue folder. He slid it down the long, polished table. It glided silently across the wood, coming to a stop directly in front of my plate. It was a stark, ugly object in a room filled with beauty. "Happy birthday, Emma," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "This is your gift." My blood ran cold. I stared at the folder, then at the faces of my children. Thomas looked down at his plate, his jaw tight. Chloe stared back at me, her expression unreadable, a blank mask of indifference. There was no sympathy, no confusion, no love, just silent, unified consent. They were in on this. This was a coup, and I was being overthrown by my own blood. With shaking hands, I opened the folder. The first page was a legal document, the bold letters at the top screaming at me. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. But it was more than that. Page after page detailed the seizure of assets, a motion to have me immediately removed from our home, citing it as the primary property of the CEO of Vance Interiors, an injunction barring me from the company offices. A document signed by the board, which I now realized Richard had quietly packed with his own loyalists, terminating my position as creative director, effective immediately. And then came the worst part, a series of financial statements and waivers, all bearing my signature, relinquishing my founding shares and partnership rights in exchange for a nominal buyout that had been funneled into a joint account he had since drained. I remembered signing them, over. The past year, Richard would bring home stacks of paperwork, saying they were routine tax forms, corporate restructuring documents, things he knew I found tedious. "Just sign here, honey. It's just boring legal stuff," he'd say, and I, trusting him completely, had signed without a second thought. I had signed away my entire life. "How," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "How could you do this?" I looked at my children, my voice breaking. "Thomas, Chloe, you knew about this." Thomas finally looked up, his eyes hard. "It's just business, Mom. Dad built the company. We're protecting its future." "Protecting it?" I cried, my voice rising with hysteria. "I built it with him, my designs, my work." "Your designs were a component," Richard cut in, his voice sharp and dismissive. "But I managed the money, I made the deals, I built the empire. You were an employee, a well-compensated one, but an employee nonetheless, and your employment is now terminated." Chloe spoke for the first time, her voice as cold as ice. "We have to think about our futures, Mom. Dad has secured them. This is what's best for the family." "The family?" They stood there, a united front, speaking of the family as if I were no longer a part of it. I had been excised, surgically removed, and they were the remaining healthy tissue. The pain was indescribable. It was a physical agony, a knife twisting in my chest. The betrayal from Richard was one thing. I could almost comprehend a loveless marriage ending in a power grab. But my children, my babies, whom I had nurtured, loved, and supported. For them to stand by and watch this happen, to be complicit in my destruction, was a wound from which I knew I would never recover. "Get out," I choked out, pushing the papers away from me as if they were poison. Richard laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Emma. This is my house now, my company, my family. You are the one who is leaving." As if on cue, two large men in dark suits entered the dining room. They were private security. They stood silently by the door, their presence a clear and brutal message. Richard gestured towards them. "You have 1 hour to pack a bag with your personal belongings. Anything else will be forwarded to you at a later date. Don't make a scene." He turned and walked out of the dining room, Thomas and Chloe following in his wake like loyal soldiers. They didn't look back. Not once. I was left alone at the long, beautiful table, surrounded by flickering candles and the ruins of my life, the navy blue folder sitting in front of me like a tombstone. My birthday gift was my own burial. The hour they gave me was both an eternity and a fleeting second. I moved through the house in a fog, a ghost in the home I had created. The two security guards followed me at a distance, their silent presence a constant, humiliating reminder of my new status as an intruder. I went to our bedroom, the sanctuary of cream and gray, and it felt alien to me. Richard's things were still there, but my presence felt wrong, temporary. I opened my closet, a vast walk-in space filled with clothes and accessories I had collected over a lifetime. What do you pack when your entire life has been stolen? What bag is big enough to carry the weight of such a betrayal? I grabbed a small suitcase and threw in some basic clothes, toiletries, my laptop, and a small jewelry box containing a few pieces from my grandmother. Every object I touched screamed with memory. A photograph on my nightstand of the four of us on a beach in Greece, all smiles and sun-kissed skin. A lie. A drawing Chloe had made for me when she was 6, framed on my wall. A lie. Thomas's little league trophy on a shelf. A lie. My entire history felt like a meticulously constructed fraud. As I was about to leave the room, my eyes landed on the safe hidden behind a painting. It was where we kept important documents, passports, birth certificates, and the original incorporation papers for Vance Interiors. On a desperate whim, I entered the code. It opened. They hadn't changed it. They probably assumed I was too shattered to think logically. I grabbed my passport and a few other personal documents, but then my fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope tucked away at the very back. I didn't recognize it. Driven by a sudden, sharp instinct, I pulled it out and shoved it into my suitcase without looking inside. It was a small act of defiance in a sea of surrender. Walking down the grand staircase for the last time felt like a scene from a movie. I was a deposed queen being exiled from her kingdom. As I reached the front door, one of the guards handed me a cashier's check. It was for $50,000. "Mr. Vance said this is your final severance payment," the man said, his voice monotone. $50,000. A pittance. It was an insult disguised as generosity, enough to keep me from being destitute immediately, but not enough to mount any S. Eeriest challenge. It was meant to break my spirit, to show me I was nothing without him. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing the final closing of a chapter of my life. I stood on the pristine driveway, my small suitcase by my side, and looked back at the magnificent house, its windows glowing with warm light. It looked like a happy home. The lie was still being told, only now I was on the outside of it. I had no car, the luxury vehicles were all registered to the company. I had no access to our joint bank accounts. My phone buzzed with an alert. My corporate credit card had been declined. They were cutting every string, one by one. I used an app to call a taxi, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. As I climbed into the back seat, I saw a curtain move in an upstairs window. One of them was watching. The taxi driver asked, "Where to, ma'am?" And I realized I had nowhere to go. I couldn't call my friends, they were our friends, Richard's friends. They were part of the life I had just been evicted from, and I had no doubt whose side they would take. My family lived in another state, and I was too ashamed, too broken, to call them and explain what had happened. So I gave the driver the name of a boutique hotel downtown, a place I had designed the lobby for years ago. The hotel room was luxurious but sterile. It felt like another world. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the $50,000 check and the manila envelope on the nightstand beside me. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Richard hadn't just divorced me. He had erased me. He had orchestrated this with military precision, ensuring I was left with nothing. No home, no money, no company, and most painfully, no family. He and my children had conspired to strip me of my entire identity. How long had this been planned? Months? Years? Every loving word, every shared laugh, every family dinner replayed in my mind, now tainted with the bitter taste of deceit. Had Chloe's hand squeeze at lunch been a gesture of pity? Was Thomas's pride in his new role just a performance? The depth of the deception was a bottomless abyss. They hadn't just fallen out of love with me, they had actively plotted my destruction while smiling to my face. I finally broke. A raw, guttural sob tore from my throat, the kind of sound you make when a part of your soul dies. I cried for the husband I thought I had, for the children I adored, for the life I had poured every ounce of my being into building. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my body ached with the emptiness. Hours later, when the tears finally subsided, something else took their place. A flicker of something hard and cold. Anger, a rage so pure and so intense it burned away the sorrow. They thought they could break me. They thought I was just a creative mind, a fragile artist who couldn't survive without Richard's business acumen. They thought they could throw me away like one of my old design sketches and I would simply disappear. They had underestimated me. They had forgotten that I wasn't just the architect of our perfect life. I was also the architect of my own. I had built an empire from nothing once before. I could do it again. My eyes fell on the manila envelope. It was time to stop crying and start fighting. It was time to see what secrets my husband had left behind. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a singular, driving purpose. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but the rage was a fire beneath it. I ordered coffee and a plate of food I barely touched, my mind already racing. I had $50,000, a suitcase of clothes, and a mysterious manila envelope. It wasn't much to start a war with, but it was a start. First, I needed an ally, a real one. The name that came to mind was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a corporate lawyer I had known for years. He had been a friend of both Richard and me back in the early days, before the massive success, before our social circle became a curated collection of Richard's business associates. Marcus was sharp, scrupulously honest, and he had never been impressed by Richard's blustering charm. We had lost touch over the years as Richard had subtly pushed away anyone who wasn't completely in his sphere of influence. I found his firm online and called his direct line, praying he would take my call. Emma Vance, is that you?" His voice was warm, surprised. "It's been years, how are you?" The simple question almost broke me again. "Not good, Marcus. I'm in serious trouble. I need your help." We met an hour later in a quiet corner of a small cafe. I told him everything. The birthday dinner, the divorce papers, the seizure of assets, the children's betrayal. I watched his expression shift from friendly curiosity to shock, and then to a cold, professional fury. He listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "That man is not just a monster, he's a meticulous one," Marcus said, his voice grim. He's built a legal fortress around himself, Emma. Those documents you signed, he's been planning this for a very long time. Challenging them head-on will be nearly impossible. He'll bury you in legal fees and tie you up in court for a decade. So that's it, he wins. The despair I had been holding at bay threatened to swamp me. "No," Marcus said, leaning forward. "We don't fight him where he's strongest. We don't go after the castle walls. We look for the cracks in the foundation." He nodded towards the manila envelope I had placed on the table between us. "What's in there?" I admitted I hadn't looked yet. Together, we opened it. It wasn't filled with legal documents or financial statements. It was filled with receipts, credit card statements from cards I didn't recognize, and printouts of emails. It took us a few minutes to understand what we were looking at. They were records of an affair. Richard had a mistress, but it was far worse than that. The woman was the head of acquisitions at the very development firm that had awarded us the massive Dubai hotel project, my supposed magnum opus. The emails, printed from a secret account, detailed their relationship, but they also detailed their collusion. He had been feeding her proprietary information, insider details about our competitors' bids. In return, she ensured Vance Interiors won the contract, but the receipts told the real story. He wasn't just paying for lavish gifts and secret vacations. He was paying her. Huge sums of money, disguised as consulting fees, were being funneled from a subsidiary of Vance Interiors into a shell corporation registered in her name. He hadn't won the Dubai project with my brilliant design. He had bought it, using company funds to finance his bribery and his affair. "This is it," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with a lawyer's predatory excitement. "This is the crack. This isn't just marital infidelity, this is corporate fraud. He used company assets to commit a crime." Suddenly, other details started to click into place in my mind. The trips Richard took alone, supposedly to scout locations. The sudden, unexplained promotion of a junior accountant in the finance department, someone who was likely helping him cook the books. The way Richard had insisted on handling all the financial negotiations for the Dubai project himself, telling me to focus on the creative. He had been isolating me, pushing me out of the business side of the company long before he pushed me out of the house. Our next steps were clear. Marcus hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, unassuming woman named Lena who had a reputation for finding money that didn't want to be found. While Lena started digging into the shell corporation and the company's convoluted finances, I started doing my own research. I used a new laptop and public Wi-Fi, creating anonymous email accounts to contact former employees of Vance Interiors, people who had been fired or had quit under mysterious circumstances over the last few years. The stories started pouring in. A project manager who was fired after questioning suspicious expense reports from Richard. a designer who quit after Richard stole her concept and presented it as his own. A pattern emerged of a man systematically removing anyone with integrity, anyone loyal to me or to the original vision of our company, and replacing them with sycophants who wouldn't ask questions. He had been rotting the company from the inside out. The most painful discovery came from a source I least expected. Clara, my former assistant, I reached out and she agreed to meet, terrified of being seen. She told me that for months, Thomas had been sitting in on closed-door meetings with Richard and the lawyers. She had overheard them talking about the transition and how to minimize the Emma factor. Thomas wasn't just a pawn, he was an active participant in the conspiracy against his own mother. He had chosen money and power over me. And Chloe, Richard had set her up with a trust fund, contingent on her loyalty to him, and had been paying her exorbitant university fees and a lavish allowance directly from a corporate account, disguised as a student stipend program. He hadn't earned their loyalty, he had purchased it. Each new piece of information was like another twist of the knife, but with every wound came a strange sense of clarity. The family I was mourning was an illusion. The man I had loved and the children I had raised were strangers. They had made a calculated business decision to cut me out, and now I was going to make a calculated business decision of my own. Richard thought he had left me with nothing. He was wrong. He had left me with the truth. And the truth, as Marcus liked to say, was not just a shield, it was a weapon. The initial rage and the thrill of discovery eventually gave way to the harsh, cold reality of my situation. I was living in a hotel, burning through the $50,000 at an alarming rate. The legal battle Marcus was preparing would take time and money I didn't have. Richard's legal fortress was designed to withstand a long siege, and he could easily bankrupt me with procedural delays before we ever got to court. The fraud evidence was our ace, but we needed to play it at the right moment. In the meantime, I had to survive. "You need to get out of that hotel," Marcus advised during one of our daily strategy calls. "You need to get your feet back on the ground, Emma. Show them you're not broken." He was right. Hiding away felt like a defeat. The first step was finding a place to live. I used a portion of the remaining money to secure a lease on a small, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city I barely knew. It was a world away from the opulent mansion on the hill. The rooms were small, the view was of a brick wall, and the silence was absolute. There were no staff, no gardeners, just me. The first night I spent there, I cried. Not the gut-wrenching sobs of betrayal, but quiet, weary tears of loneliness. It was humbling. It was terrifying. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. I bought a cheap coffee maker. I found a small grocery store around the corner. I started to build a routine. In the stark simplicity of the small apartment, stripped of all the luxuries and responsibilities of my old life, I began to find myself again. Not Emma Vance, the co-founder of a corporate empire. Not Emma Vance, the wife and mother. Just Emma. One afternoon, staring at the blank walls of my new apartment, an old, familiar feeling sparked within me. The itch to create. I had a laptop and a deep well of knowledge and talent that Richard couldn't take from me. My signature was on the documents that signed away my company, but it wasn't on the ones that signed away my mind. I used the last of my savings, a bold and reckless move, to start from scratch. I registered a new business. It felt absurd, tapping the details into a cheap laptop while sitting on a cardboard box that served as my temporary desk. I called it Phoenix Design. It was a cliché, I knew, but it was my cliché, rising from the ashes. It was all I had. I had no office, no staff, no funding. All I had was my reputation, or what was left of it. I started making calls. Not to the big-name clients from my past, but to the smaller ones, the contractors, the suppliers, the artisans I had worked with over the years. These were the people who knew the difference between my work and Richard's bluster. The first few calls were brutal. Some were hesitant, afraid of crossing Richard. Others had heard the rumors he was undoubtedly spreading, that I had a breakdown, that I had left him, that I was unstable. But then, one call went differently. It was with a custom furniture maker named David, a master craftsman whose work I had championed for years. "Emma," he said, his voice warm with genuine concern. "I heard what happened. It's a disgrace." "I'm starting something new, David," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Something small. I have a potential client, a small restaurant that needs a redesign, but the budget is tiny. I can't pay your usual rates." He was quiet for a moment. "Send me the plans," he said finally. "We'll work something out. Your eye is worth more than Richard Vance's entire bank account." That one conversation was the crack of light I needed. It gave me the courage to keep calling. Slowly, painstakingly, I started to pull together a small network of loyalists. A painter here, a fabric supplier there. People who valued artistry over corporate greed. My first project was that small restaurant. I poured every ounce of my energy into it. I did the sketches myself, managed the budget, oversaw every detail. I was the CEO and the intern all at once. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a burning need to prove I could not just survive, but thrive. When the restaurant reopened, it was a modest success, but it created a buzz in the local design community. The work was fresh, innovative, and deeply personal. It was pure Emma, undiluted by corporate branding or Richard's commercial demands. Another small project followed, then another. A boutique clothing store. A private residence for a young tech entrepreneur who was more impressed by my portfolio than the gossip columns. I ran Phoenix Design from my apartment, turning my living room into a studio. It was chaotic and stressful, but it was also exhilarating. I was in complete control. Every success was mine. Every decision, every failure was my own. I was no longer a component in someone else's machine. I was building my own. 6 months after my disastrous birthday, I finally moved into a small, shared office space. I hired my first employee, a bright young design graduate who was hungry to learn. Phoenix Design was still a tiny fish in a vast ocean, while Vance Interiors was the whale. But we were agile, we were passionate, and we were creating work that mattered. One evening, working late, I saw an article online. It was a feature on Richard, lauding him as the sole genius behind Vance Interiors' success. It mentioned the Dubai project as his crowning achievement. It also mentioned his 2 wonderful children, Thomas and Chloe, who were poised to take over the family legacy. There was a photo of the 3 of them, smiling, standing in the lobby of my old home. There was no mention of me. I had been completely written out of my own history. The old Emma would have dissolved into tears, but the woman I was becoming, the founder of Phoenix Design, simply looked at the picture, closed the laptop, and went back to work. Richard could have the past. He could have the lies and the stolen glory. I was busy building the future. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my future would be far brighter than his. 2 years passed. 2 years of relentless work, sleepless nights, and unwavering focus. Phoenix Design grew from a one-woman operation in a tiny apartment to a respected and sought-after boutique firm. We didn't compete with the corporate giants like Vance Interiors on scale, but we beat them on creativity, agility, and a genuine connection with our clients. My name, once whispered about in gossip columns, was now spoken with admiration in boardrooms. I had not only survived, I had built a new kingdom on the ashes of my old one. Meanwhile, cracks were beginning to show in Richard's empire. Without my creative vision, Vance Interiors had become sterile and repetitive. Richard was a numbers man, not an artist. He chased trends instead of setting them, and his designs felt hollow, lacking the soul that had once defined our brand. Key talent, designers I had personally mentored, began to leave, tired of the toxic, profit-at-all-costs culture. Several of them even came to work for me at Phoenix. We also started winning bids against them. First, it was small projects, then larger ones. The final blow to his ego came when the prestigious Beaumont Hotel Group, a legacy client of Vance Interiors for over a decade, announced they were awarding the redesign of their flagship London hotel to us. Richard was losing his grip, and he was becoming reckless. Marcus, who had been patiently monitoring the situation, called me. "It's time, Emma," he said. "He's vulnerable. His company is leveraged to the hilt to finance the Dubai project, and I've heard from my sources that there are construction delays and massive cost overruns. The fraud evidence we have is the push that will send him over the edge. Our plan was simple and surgical. We wouldn't leak the story to the press. That was too messy, too public. The revenge I wanted was not on the front page of a tabloid, it was professional annihilation. The venue was the annual Global Design Summit, the most important industry event of the year. Richard was the keynote speaker, a last-ditch effort to project strength and reassure his nervous investors and clients. I attended the summit not as a spectator, but as a panelist on a discussion about emerging design trends. When I walked into the main hall, I could feel the ripple of whispers. I hadn't seen Richard, Thomas, or Chloe in person in 2 years. I saw them sitting in the front row, a united family of vipers. Richard caught my eye across the crowded room. He looked older, his face strained beneath his confident facade. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes before he masked it with a condescending smirk. My children, Thomas and Chloe, stared at me with a mixture of shock and resentment, as if I had no right to be there. I simply gave a small, polite nod and took my seat. Richard's keynote speech was a disaster. It was a rambling, self-aggrandizing monologue about his vision, filled with corporate buzzwords and devoid of any real substance. He unveiled a new line of designs that were uninspired and dated. The audience grew restless. The applause at the end was polite but lukewarm. Then came the Q&A session. This was the moment Marcus and I had planned for. A journalist from a major industry publication, whom Marcus had discreetly provided with some background information, stood up. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice crisp and clear. "You've spoken at length about your firm's success, particularly the Dubai hotel project. Could you comment on the recent investigation by the Emirati authorities into allegations of bribery and financial misconduct connected to the awarding of that contract?" The silence in the hall was absolute. Every eye turned to Richard, the blood drained from his face. He stammered, calling the question baseless slander, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Another hand went up. It was the CEO of the Beaumont Hotel Group, the client who had recently left him for me. "Richard," he asked, his voice carrying across the entire auditorium. "It's not just about rumors, it's about integrity. It's about vision, and frankly, your company has lost both. That's why we and many others are choosing to work with firms that prioritize creativity and ethical practices." He then turned and looked directly at me, sitting on the stage. Firms like Phoenix Design. It was a public execution. Richard stood on the stage, exposed and humiliated, his carefully constructed image as an industry titan shattered in an instant. I watched as Thomas stared at the floor, his face pale, finally understanding the true cost of his father's actions. Chloe looked on the verge of tears, her fantasy of a life of endless wealth evaporating before her eyes. I didn't say a word, I didn't have to. My success was my statement. My presence was my revenge. I had not come to tear him down, I had simply built something better, something stronger, something real. He had destroyed himself with his own greed and corruption. After the Q&A ended abruptly, Richard and his children were swarmed by reporters. I slipped out a side door. As I was waiting for my car, a voice called my name. It was Thomas. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. He looked lost, a boy playing dress-up in his father's suit. I'm so sorry." I looked at him, at the son who had stood by and watched my world burn. I felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, like a memory of a pain I no longer felt. "Sorry for what, Thomas?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "Are you sorry for what you did, or are you sorry that it all fell apart?" He had no answer. He just stood there as my car pulled up. I got in without another word and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the shadow of his father's collapsed empire. The reckoning had come, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet, undeniable truth. The fallout from the summit was swift and brutal. The bribery allegations triggered a full-blown corporate investigation. Clients fled Vance Interiors in droves. Investors pulled their funding. Within 6 months, the company that had taken 25 years to build filed for bankruptcy. The empire was officially dead. Richard, facing multiple lawsuits and a federal investigation into corporate fraud, was ruined. The mansion, the cars, the entire apparatus of his stolen wealth. It was all seized and liquidated to pay off his massive debts. My revenge was complete, yet I felt no triumphant glee. There was no joy in watching the final, ugly collapse. Instead, there was a quiet, profound sense of closure. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. I had built my own new castle. It wasn't a sprawling mansion on a hill, but a chic, modern house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, a house I had designed and built for myself with the profits from Phoenix Design. It was smaller, but it was entirely mine. It was filled with light, art, and peace. It was a home, not a stage. My company continued to flourish, becoming a benchmark in the industry for innovation and integrity. I had found a new professional family in the talented and loyal team I had assembled. I was respected, I was financially independent, and most importantly, I was happy. One afternoon, about a year after the summit, I received a letter. It was from Chloe. It was long and rambling, full of excuses and self-pity. She wrote about how hard her life was now, how she had to drop out of her expensive university and get a job. She claimed she had been manipulated by her father, that she was young and didn't understand. She ended the letter by asking if she could see me, if we could try to rebuild what we had lost. A few weeks later, Thomas called. He sounded like a different person, humbled, lost. He was working a low-level sales job, trying to make ends meet. He apologized profusely, crying on the phone, saying it was the biggest mistake of his life. He begged for my forgiveness, for a second chance. I listened to both of their appeals. The maternal part of my heart, the part that had loved them unconditionally for over 2 decades, ached. But the woman who had clawed her way back from ruin knew better. I agreed to meet them, both together, in a neutral location, a public park cafe. They looked like children playing dress-up, their cheap clothes a stark contrast to the designer outfits I remembered. They were filled with remorse, but it was the remorse of people who had lost their safety net. I let them say everything they needed to say. When they were finished, I spoke, my voice gentle but firm. "I hear your apologies," I said, "and I hope, for your own sakes, that you can learn from this and build better lives for yourselves. But I cannot let you back into my life." Tears streamed down Chloe's face. "But why? We're your children." "You are," I acknowledged. "But trust is like one of my designs. It requires a strong foundation. You didn't just crack the foundation of our family. You took a sledgehammer to it, ground it into dust, and helped your father pave over it. You made a choice. You stood with him and watched me be thrown out with nothing. That isn't something a mother can simply forgive and forget." I explained that my forgiveness wasn't something they could earn back. It was something I had to give myself. I had forgiven them for my own peace of mind, so I could move on without bitterness. But forgiveness and reconciliation were 2 very different things. "I will always be your mother," I concluded, standing up from the table. "And I hope you both find happiness. But the door to my life, to my home, is closed. You need to build your own foundations now. Goodbye." I walked away without looking back. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most necessary. My healing required boundaries. My new life had no room for the ghosts of my old one. I am a solitary queen in my new castle, but I am not lonely. My life is full, with work that I love, with friends who are loyal and true, and with a quiet, unshakable sense of self-worth. The betrayal on my 48th birthday was not the end of my story. It was the violent, painful, and ultimately liberating beginning of my true one. They took everything from me, but in doing so, they gave me the greatest gift of all, myself.